So the next talk is about the influence of the quality of nursing care in the recovery of downer dairy cows. Thanks, Philip.
Righto, so this obviously leads on from the first talk, and this paper was published in the June edition of the Australian Vet Journal this year. So the two reports were concurrent as far as each month of the AVJ. So same acknowledgements. And so I suppose just to set the scene, and I suppose it's typical, it's fitting this morning with after Dan and Nina were awarded the Wellbeing Award, is that the work I'm doing is also very much up there as an animal welfare issue. And that's an issue both from the individual animal, the cow that's down, that's being nursed, obviously is a potential welfare issue for that cow, but it's also a major potential issue for the dairy industry. And that's why Dairy Australia were involved with getting me in to do this research, because this is a picture I took of one of my farms that was nursing his 4 down cows. Now, you could probably agree with me that that's not very desirable. That's the sort of thing that we don't want to have happening. We don't want cows to be looked after in that way. So a lot of the work I've done is to try and promote better nursing of dairy cows in Australia and beyond. And also, I suppose, we need to consider the risk that an image like that in the hands of animal activists could potentially have to our dairy industry. So it's an industry issue for Australia, and obviously one that's all applicable around the world. So that's just to set the scene there. Okay, so following on from the first part of my talk, the second bit was really to look at whether the quality of nursing care that the cows were subjected with had any impact on either the outcome and or the occurrence of secondary damage. Because if there was, that could then be used to then try and define the best practice for nursing recumbent cows, at least in our part of the world. So I suppose those two pictures there, if I say to you, do you think that the way those 2 cows are being nursed will have any impact in their outcome? You'd probably think that there might be something in that. So again, that's the definition of the down versus the downer cow, in case any other people have just come in that weren't here for the first one. So as part of my research, as I was going back and looking at these cows multiple times, I was recording how the farmers were looking after them, and I was recording everything that I possibly could. And when I'd go back the second or the third time, would measure that again and record all that again. So from that, how did I was going to organise it and analyse it? So what I did sort of towards the end of the time was, by looking at how all these different cows have been managed, reading the little available information in the literature about what's best practice for downer cows, and based on my own experience, I ended up coming up with what I consider to be the gold standard of nursing downer cows for southern Australia. And I won't have time to go through that today, but I said, right, well, this is what I consider the way they should be nursed. And then to analyse that, I then come up with my nursing scores, which is basically the level of compliance that each of those cows were subjected to during the course of their recumbency. And I break that down into 4 quartiles just to make it easier to analyse it. Now again, this is a field observational study, so it's not something that we had a lot of control over. And it's also important to note that the way the cows were nursed during their recumbency often varied. So when I first came there, it might have been nursed differently to the way it was the second time or later on. So the compliance scores, for example, a cow that I considered nursing score 2, which is good, was between 50 and 75% compliance to what I would consider my gold standard. Now that might mean that for all of the time she was nursed at that 50 to 75% level, or it might mean that she was actually nursed poorly at one stage and then excellent later on, so on average she was nursed at a good level. So took into account both the quality and the length of time at those different levels. And I'd broken them down into the initial nursing score, so that was the conditions when I first saw the cow, the subsequent nursing conditions, which was the time I directly observed, and then the overall was the weighted mean of those 2. And they're the figures that I'll be using today with these analysis, is the overall nursing scores. Now, I assigned them at the end of their nursing period of time, but strictly on the basis of the criteria that I'd set, even though I knew the outcome, which could subject me to bias. And for some analyses, I put 1 and 2 together and call that satisfactory nursing, as opposed to unsatisfactory nursing, which is conditions 3 and 4. And we then compared that at looking at day 7 and final outcome and secondary damage. Okay, so again, that's the features of our dairy farms. Again, this is the chart which is in the journal with all the details about what I consider to be my gold standard. And I'm not going to go through that because that's a whole hour in itself. But basically, it's looking at all the different factors that could be affecting the cows during the period of time. So results. As I said, that was the outcome. We had 24% up and 30 at day 7 and 32% eventually. And we had that 79% had some sort of significant clinical secondary damage. So how did that stack up when we analysed that against nursing score? So combining those two scores into satisfactory and unsatisfactory nursing score and looking at the occurrence of clinically important secondary damage, you can see there's an odds ratio of 2.4 if a cow has been nursed unsatisfactorily. So pretty good numbers there saying that nursing quality does increase the risk of secondary damage occurring. So that was a good finding to start with. I told you there before that if she had secondary damage, well then she was nearly 8 times less likely to recover. So we're now starting to build a picture that if we're having poor nursing, we're more likely to get secondary damage, which we know is going to make them less likely to recover. So looking at our figures from before, say day 7 and final recovery was those two figures there. That's for all of my cows, my 218. If we now break that down according to my 4 nursing scores, and if you look across here, and instantaneously you can see there's a huge difference in survival based purely on our nursing quality. And by having 218 cows, all those different primary causes, we're quite happy with our statistical figures were powerful enough to be able to isolate these two things and come up with some valid numbers. So that's looking pretty exciting from where I'm standing. So again, if we look at satisfactory versus unsatisfactory, chance of recovering by day 7, we have an odds ratio there of 7.3. So a huge difference in recovery day 7 based on their nursing quality. Now if we look at the 46 cows that were nursed longer than 7 days, we end up with 17 of those girls got up, so 37% of those got up. But if we break that down according to the 2 levels of nursing, then you can see all of those 17 that recovered were ones that were being nursed at a satisfactory level, whereas none of the 9 cows being nursed at an unsatisfactory level recovered. So therefore, when we look at our odds ratios for our final recovery, you can see that's actually increased even more. That's now up nearly 12-fold difference in recovery based on our nursing quality. And that sort of makes sense because the longer a cow is going to be subjected to substandard nursing, the more likely secondary damage is to occur, the less likely she is to recover, and therefore that all makes sense. So let's put that into a picture. I always like pictures rather than lots of tables. And this, I think, is a really exciting graph that, and I love showing this to farmers because you can say, okay, well, look, if you're going to nurse a cow at a really crappy level, why waste all that time? Okay, a couple of them got up in the first couple of days, but after that, no matter how long they were nursed, one was nursed for 28 days, she still didn't get up. If you're going to nurse them at a really poor level, not a single one of those 15 cows recovered. But hey, if you start getting some good and some excellent nursing, you're going to have cows continue to recover right through the 3rd and even into the 4th week. One of those cows, there's 3 left at the end of the last, in the 4th week, and one of those cows recovered on day 27. So we've got a really nice shaped curve here, and these cows continued to recover the whole way along the way, whereas these ones down here didn't. And man, there's a hell of a difference between those 2 lines. So I've been banging on about good nursing for cows for a long, long time to both vets and to farmers, but now I've actually got some figures and show a graph like that. All of a sudden you think, oh, hang on, what's this nursing all about, Phil? Let's tell me more about that. What was interesting was looking at the level of nursing. When I first attended the cows, nearly half of the cows were being nursed under what I considered to be unsatisfactory level. And those 3 pictures there are 3 of the ways that cows are being nursed when I first turned up. And during the overall nursing, there was still somewhere about a third of them that I considered to be nursed unsatisfactory. Now, as a vet, that was hard for me to come along and watch how terribly they were being nursed. And some of the cows, we'd actively engage with them and change it to then bring it up to a high level to see what differences we had. But when I was seeing a lot of these cows being nursed poorly, whilst it was bad from a veterinary point of view, as a researcher it was quite exciting to see this great contrast between the ways they're being nursed, hence the quality of my work here. So, in conclusions, so a very strong relationship between nursing quality and both recovery at day 7 and final. Really good numbers there. Odds ratios at 12, that's pretty good stuff, I reckon. And it makes sense because if you've got good quality nursing, you're going to have a number of things happening. You've got giving the cow a much better chance of recovering from a primary condition. And as I've shown, you're having a much less chance of them suffering some sort of important clinical secondary damage. And if they have suffered that clinical damage, they've got more likelihood of recovering from that if they're given enough time. And the fact that these cows are being nursed at a high level continue to improve for an ongoing period of time means that if the cow's not up after 2 or 3 days or 4 or 5 days or whatever you want to say, there's no need to destroy that cow based purely on the period of time that she's been down. Obviously, if the farmer doesn't want to continue and doesn't have the time or facility to continue nursing that cow, well, it needs to be destroyed. But if he is going to provide good quality nursing, there's every chance that cow will recover given enough chance, providing she's nursed at a high level. It's also worth noting that the standard of nursing was generally very low, and that means there's huge abilities to improve the welfare of the industry by better education for farmers. Final remark, I suppose, with the downer cows must be nursed at a high level or they need to be euthanased properly. If they're not up after 2 or 3 days, they're not going to get up, so let's euthanase them and move on. And that means that as vets, we have to actively engage in the nursing environment that this cow is going to be provided with. If we're coming along and looking at a down cow, no matter what she's down for, providing really good veterinary care, doing all the sexy stuff, the IVs and the antibiotics and the non-stads and all that sort of stuff, and then leave the cow being nursed in a poor position, we're wasting our time because we haven't done our job. And I think it's very important that we as vets actively engage in the nursing quality of our patients. Study limitations, there's certainly possibly, could be criticised for some of the way it was set up, but because it was an observational study, we really didn't have a lot of choice of that, and I'll move on from that. And just for the last thing, there's a lot of information on the Dairy Australia website on how to manage cows. There's some PDF files and there's some short videos which I've put up, which are basically aimed at farmers, and that's all about to be revised very soon to have some even better quality stuff, including some of these results. So with that, I'll apologise for going over time and hang you over to Laura for questions. So, thank you.
I mean, it's great work on a very vulnerable category of animals. I enjoyed it. Has anyone any questions?
One down there.
Yes, there's... Oh, sorry.
Oh, I've got a microphone. No. Sorry, yeah, a couple of weeks.
Very interesting. Good characterization of down cows. I enjoyed that. I was curious about a couple things. You found about a third of them were hypocalcemia and pregnancy toxemia. I wondered if that surprised you, that those two conditions led to downers so much. And also, did you ever see any evidence that within a farm, they might make a judgment, prognostic, and say this cow has a poor prognosis or is not so likely, and then just human nature or whatever, they nurse the cow more poorly because she didn't seem to be a good candidate to get up?
Yeah, that's a fair comment about whether the cows that didn't have a good chance were nursed poorly, so therefore they didn't have a good recovery. And there probably is a component of that. But I think, again, over the number of cows I had, and with 96 different farms, I'm hoping that most of those sort of factors would have neutralised themselves out to still come back with our valid findings. But again, I suppose it comes back that if a farmer doesn't want to nurse a cow at a high level because he thinks it's got a no chance, well, let's get the message across to him, destroy that cow on day 1 or day 2, not nurse her in a poor way for a week before he then gives up and destroys it. So if they can't nurse them well enough at a high enough standard, let's euthanize them promptly and move on, rather than, you know, doing a poor job.
So how about the pregnancy toxemia and the hypocalcemia? Did that surprise you? That was about a third of them, that they led to that?
I was pleased that there was that many of them to give us a good spread of different causes. But yes, there were. The pregnancy toxemia in our area varies a lot depending on the seasons, and because again we're pasture-based, if it's a poor autumn, then we end up having skinnier cows and more likely have a lot of preg tox. We don't tend to have the excessively over-fat preg tox cows like you might in Europe or in North America, so they're more ones that are poorer condition, I suppose. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, there was somebody here first, and it has to be very quick. Question.
Hello? Okay. Tim Cornell from the UK. I just have a quick question. I don't know if you can answer that based on your criteria. Is there any action that would you recommend that has the most success in your nursing care? Is it basically just putting it upright, rolling it over, or lifting it up?
I think it's the whole package. So I think if you do one component well but neglect other parts, then you're not going to get the result. So it really is doing a lot of things well for all of the time. It's quite a complicated thing, and a lot of the factors interact with each other. So it's a whole subject in itself. Yeah. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip.